Hello, students. We're going to finish up topic 5, looking at this decade of change, the 1920s, by looking at the societal tensions of the decade. And these come as a result of a lot of the social changes that were occurring in the period after World War I, and resistance to change. We saw some of that with the rural-urban divide, but we're going to throw into the mix fears over the communist revolution in Russia, nativism in America's age-old problem of racism, to add even more to these tensions. We'll start by looking at the Red Scare and the concerns about communism. The communist revolution in Russia really shook a lot of the world, and the United States was no exception. There was a lot of concern that a revolution, a radical revolution of communists or anarchists or socialists, something of that sort on the vague left side of the spectrum, was going to take over America like it happened with Russia. And there was some hints of trouble, at least on the labor front. Demobilization after World War I led to rapid inflation and an increase in unemployment in America as more men were competing for work, as we'd seen before. And this led to some widespread labor strikes in 1919. A full 20% of the American labor force was on strike at one point or another during 1919. And this was largely in response to, a need for increases in pay and reductions in hours. As we had seen previously in the late 19th, early 20th century, police responses to these strikes often turned violent, and the media in this case blamed communists and anarchists for having aggravated the problems. This all contributes to the first Red Scare. We'll see a second one in the late 1940s, early 1950s. The first Red Scare of 1919-1920 was this fear of suspected radicals that were going to plot a revolution in the United States. And this one was very tied up in also Americans' concerns and fears about immigration, as we had seen this dramatic increase in immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe in the decades prior to this. And the response to this is one of those situations where when we get scared, we get stupid. And Americans were very willing to let their government kind of walk all over civil rights in pursuit of communists. One example of this would be the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, who were two Italian immigrants who were accused of murder and convicted on very, very little evidence. And the primary reason it seems that they were convicted was because they held radical beliefs, not because they were actually committed the crime. Another example would be the Palmer raids. A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General. And in response to a series of bombings, mail bombings in particular, one bombing that killed, I believe, 40 people on Wall Street by suspected radicals, probably radical anarchists, there was a series of raids on immigrant homes. And it was not a particularly well-targeted series of raids. The people that they were arresting were immigrants, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Again, we've got this association of radicalism with Southern and Eastern Europeans, but they weren't necessarily provably any part of a radical movement. And a lot of these people were arrested and deported without any sort of trial or due process. And in the wake of this, or during this, the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, will be formed in order to try and sort of fight some of these violations of civil rights during the Red Scare in court. Now, we had spoken previously about the great migration of African Americans out of the South and into the northern cities that saw a real spike in migration during World War I because of the job opportunities in the factories there. Well, the North was not necessarily a complete turnaround for life for many African Americans. Racism was just as present there as it was in the South. And although there were more opportunities in the North, there was still a great deal of tension, racial tension in the northern cities as a result of the changing demographics there. This is going to be particularly sharp after World War I, when many soldiers return home, and there's going to be more competition between African American and white men for jobs, which are becoming more scarce because there's less demand after the war, as well as housing and government services. The big series of racial riots is going to be the summer of 1919, sometimes referred to as the Red Summer. At least 38 major cities saw riots between African Americans and whites. These are largely going to be whites attacking black neighborhoods, and hundreds of African Americans, mostly African Americans, are going to be killed in these riots. But one of the things that makes this different is that many African Americans are going to fight back against these attacks, which is different from many previous attacks. And a lot of these guys are also World War I veterans, so you can see sort of how that has affected a little bit of the response from African Americans to white violence. Chicago is going to be usually the worst of these riots. It lasts about 13 days, and there were about 38 people killed in this. The media and the government, when they inspect the sources of these riots, will falsely blame communists for stirring up African Americans, as if they didn't have enough reason to be angry about racism in America, that it must have somehow been some radical communists that were stirring them up. Rural areas were also subject to this violence. There was the Elaine massacre in Arkansas, where we're not really sure, whites attacked a black community, but estimates are anywhere from 100 to 237 African Americans were killed for trying to form a sharecroppers union and then being accused of fomenting a communist rebellion. And then in 1921 is the Tulsa massacre, where whites attacked the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, sometimes referred to as Black Wall Street. It was the wealthiest black community in America. They attacked both from the ground and from private aircraft, dropping explosives on the neighborhood, destroying a 35 square block area, leaving 10,000 African Americans homeless, and an estimated 75 to 300, numbers are very fuzzy, people were killed in this violence. It kind of goes to show that even when they focused on their community and building up their community themselves, racism was still going to lead to violence and attacks on African Americans. Nativism, too, is on the rise in America in response to the dramatic increase in immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe in the decades before the war. And as I mentioned before, it gets all tied up in the Red Scare, this belief that Southern and Eastern Europeans were bringing in radical ideas like anarchism and communism. Tie that back to social Darwinism that we mentioned before, and this new pseudoscience of eugenics, which is the very unscientifically held belief that characteristics like intelligence are tied to race and ancestry. And nativists wanted to block some of the undesirable people from coming into America and degrading our gene pool. It's all a bunch of bunk anyways. But the United States responds with the Immigration Act of 1924, one of our earliest immigration restrictions after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it set a very strict quota system that was aimed specifically at Southern and Eastern Europeans, severely limiting immigration from those regions. It continued the ban on East Asian immigration, although Mexican immigration was not restricted at all. Many Mexican Americans still faced a lot of discrimination. As a result, we'll see immigration drop dramatically in the 1920s, and looking farther ahead to the events of the Holocaust in Europe, many European refugees, particularly Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust, would be unable to get into the United States and find safety as a result of these restrictive immigration laws. And of course, these idiots are going to be back. Anytime you see some sort of major push for civil rights amongst groups, you're going to see pushback from far-right groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And they actually pop up 3 different times in American history. This is going to be their second major point of importance in the 1920s. And this is going to be the largest Ku Klux Klan. It's going to be probably the most widely accepted iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. It was actually reformed in 1915 at Stone Mountain, Georgia, but it grew to somewhere between 4 and 5 million people. And you can see that they're marching in front of the U.S. Capitol without masks, and it was considered socially acceptable and sometimes socially desirable among upper class, more conservative whites to be known as a part of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan's going to gain a lot of support in the North this time around. Indiana's going to be a big center of Klan activity, largely due to tensions from the Great Migration and immigration. The Ku Klux Klan is sort of widening its whole hate hug, who it loves to hate. They start targeting Jews, Catholics, and immigrants in response to the nativism of the time. They also become a staunchly anti-communist group, and for that reason oppose labor unions, also because of their ties, labor unions' ties to immigration and immigrants. And they tend to represent the traditionalist side of things. Ku Klux Klan were big supporters of prohibition, and they opposed what they called lawbreaking and immorality, which was largely anything that could be considered associated with immigrants and African Americans. And the laws that they were concerned with were the ones that restricted the rights of African Americans, in particular, like the Jim Crow laws and the immigration restrictions in America. In response to this new wave of the Klan, the NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League, which had been formed in the decades prior to this, are really going to start pushing for legal ramifications, anti-lynching laws, attempting to stop racial slurs and anti-Semitic slurs in the press, and pushing for more educational opportunities. This second wave of the Ku Klux Klan will eventually come crashing down towards the end of the 1920s, when it's discovered that its leadership is largely there to grift money off of the members. But for a while, it was a very kind of frighteningly popular group in the United States. All right, taking a look at your graphic organizer for lesson 4. I give you a series of tensions or sources of tension in the United States in the 1920s in the middle column. So underneath each one, I want you to define what it is or who they are. In the left-hand column, what is the cause of it? What led to that tension? And in the right-hand column, what was the results of that? So, for example, if we look at the first one is immigration quotas, which I defined in the middle column there as the limited number of immigrants who could enter the United States from certain countries. And what led to it was nativist fears that immigrants were bringing in radical ideas, as well as a belief in eugenics. And the effects was this dramatic drop in immigration and denying refuge for immigrants escaping things like the Holocaust later. Good luck. 我爱你，再见。